Today I'm making a Squid Game costume. But it has nothing to do with giant squids? Well then why'd I even go to the trouble to build a giant squid? Or a submarine? Well that was a year and a half of wasted R&D. For this build, I used foam floor mats, craft foam, Plastidip, super glue, hot glue, contact cement, a respirator mask, goggles, a sharpening stone, sanding implements, a strap, a painter's suit, black Carhartt gloves, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I'm starting out with a sheet of black EVA foam. I cut the puzzle pieces off of it. Mostly I'm just doing this to fit the whole thing in the frame. So it's for you guys that I'm doing this. You're welcome. The most commonly available EVA foam color is gray, which works fine, but if you use gray, you're gonna have to give it a coat of Plastidip at the end. So I'm trying to save a step by starting out with black. Whichever color you use, make sure you get the kind that has this texture on the back and not the diamond texture. I modified one of my old helmet templates into a blank face mask. Then I laid out the shapes onto the foam. A link to this template can be found in the video description down below. Then I traced their outline using a white paint marker, making sure to get into all the registration triangles. Those are to help line up the pieces later. I flipped them to get the opposite side of the face. I left some of the pieces connected at strategic places in order to try and cut down on visible seams when I'm finished. Normally, I try to arrange the shapes near the edges of the floor mat so that they leave as much empty space left over as possible. This allows me to get more mileage out of a sheet of EVA foam. However, in this instance, I'm trying to make sure the direction of the pattern on the back of each piece matches as closely as possible to the piece that it meets up with, going for consistency here. When I was finished tracing, I cut the pieces out using scissors at the edges, where smoothness doesn't really matter, but I'm using a box cutter, or a razor pen, on the edges that are gonna need to be glued together so that I get a better connection. In this case, the smoother the edge, the better the seam is gonna come out. But in order to maintain a smooth edge across a long cut, you have to continually sharpen your blade. Otherwise, it wears out as you cut and tears at the foam. Also, I'm making sure that my blade is held directly straight up and down at a right angle, because any kind of slanted angle will result in an unwanted ridge or ditch in the foam. It's kind of like plate tectonics in a microscopic way. When all the pieces were cut out, I smoothed out some of the inevitable rough spots on my belt sander. For the hard to reach areas, I use my rotary tool. That's a drawback to leaving some parts connected in this manner. It's tough to get into the corners. Luckily, those will be hidden later. Be sure to wear a mask while you're sanding because you don't want to breathe the dust. Then, I heat form the foam with my heat gun. This can burn the foam and also your skin, so be careful. Then I shaped the foam using my hands and a planishing iron, which I made out of a horribly failed infinity gem, but you know, whatever works. You can also just use a regular bowl, like a salad bowl, or more accurately a mixing bowl, because sometimes they don't have a flattened off base for some reason, or a bike helmet, that'd work. I'm actually forming these pieces opposite from how I normally make helmets, because in this rare instance, I need the texture pattern facing outwards. You'd normally only need to do that for Mass Effect armor. Then I set each piece aside to cool. I weighted it down with metal machinist blocks, which will not only help it hold in place, but the blocks, being metal, will help to disperse the heat. While it cooled, I dug up an elastic band from a broken pair of chemistry goggles to hold it onto my face. Hey Jake, how did you break the chemistry goggles? This one had a nosebleed. Do you even have a nose? A likely story. The mask pieces have been cooling long enough, so I took them out to the gluing station and began applying contact cement. You don't want to breathe this stuff, so be sure to wear a mask. First, I did the darts, then I did the edges. That probably looked a little crazy right there, but there was a very fine filament strand of glue, and if I let it settle, then it would be a visible mistake on the final project. That's why I swooped it out in that wizard-like motion. Or maybe I just cast a spell. I am, of course, building this from a mountaintop layer. I built the model, I'm gonna use the model! And that's how to make a fender. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe. What? We're not done? Alright. You could do all of these seams at once. I know it's gonna take me a couple days to edit the video, so I think I'm gonna hold off on connecting the side pieces to this middle piece. That way there's no stress on the seam that I'm doing right now until after it's 100% solidified. As it's coming together, you may notice that it's pretty lumpy, like ridiculously lumpy. Like this looks like a mask that's been run over. I can correct that, but only after the glue is totally dry. It'll become tacky within 15 minutes, but it'll still give off fumes for hours after you've contacted the seams. So I let it air out overnight. The next day, I reheated it with the heat gun in order to even out all the lumps. This did include some reheat forming and dishing, but it took much less time than the initial heat forming process, so, you know, no big deal. And I did have to refine the edges to make it more of a face mask than a helmet. These templates are actually a variant of my Daft Punk visor buck, so that's the shape that it's trying to conform to. You don't have to worry about that. I refined the templates as I was working, just to make it more of a face mask shape. So just ignore that whole part about cutting a dart in the side panels, because it's no longer really necessary. You may even want to trim the brim even more, depending on how your face is shaped. I have kind of a long face, which is why the jawline of my Stormtrooper helmets keeps coming out looking weird. I feel like my most accurate looking helmet, the Knights of Ren helmet, when I'm actually wearing that, my chin sticks out underneath it. What are you gonna do? People are shapes. What are you gonna do? Then I traced an extremely rough square onto the front with a paint pen. It occurs to me that I could have been much more precise and just drawn the shape on with the paint pen, but part of what I'm doing here is making eye holes. So let's get to it. I cut out a far better square out of the middle. With foam this thick, when you're cutting foam that's already been curved, it's kind of a temperamental process. So you want to be careful to cut in a straight line. So you want to go slowly just to not make any mistakes. In fact, if you plan your gluing a little bit better than I did and avoid putting glue on the parts of the seams that are eventually going to be the outside edge of the square, then you'll have a much easier time with this. So this offcut is garbage, but I'm going to need to hang on to it to get the scale right for reference. But for right now, I'm going to clean up the edges a little bit with my rotary tool. Then I got a white EVA foam floor mat and used the offcut to make a rough estimate of the size of the square, cut out a chunk. You can see that I'm deliberately overestimating the size here. That's because the shape is going to change drastically once I make it into a curve. Then I heat formed and dished that piece so that it would have a curve that matched the mask. Then I traced the original square offcut onto the piece of white EVA foam and cut off the edges. I checked it against the mask hole to make sure it fit. I want to make sure that it doesn't bulge out of the helmet, so I refined the edges accordingly. Also, I labeled the inside just so that I couldn't accidentally get it turned around. I cut a smaller square out of the center. Then I used that opening and the same technique as before to make yet another black curved square that would fit inside the frame with a little bit of wiggle room for me to see out of at the edges. Although this time I skewered it with the shish kebab skewer to keep from burning myself, and after pressing it, I dished it in a smaller diameter bowl. It's actually a cheap display case. See the heat coming off that? Fogging up the glass. I like to try and diffuse the heat faster with metal weights because, you know, they're at least 20 degrees cooler in my hands. Fahrenheit. Then I glued the white frame back into the mask with super glue, and the black frame with hot glue, and a 4mm craft foam support behind it. Again, I'm using weights to diffuse the heat. It's sort of floating in the center, which will create a slight gap out of which I'll be able to see through. Kind of like a pinhole effect. While it looks pretty messy on the inside, the outside shaping up nicely. Although I can see I have to reform a couple of parts of the brim at the top right there. Luckily, that's nowhere near any hot glue, so I don't have to worry about the heat gun reheating it. Now let's do something about that seam. I cut strips of 2mm craft foam, which I then glued to the mask in the center to match the detail on the show mask. This also has the added benefit of hiding that awful seam. I buy this stuff in rolls, but you can get away with just picking up a single 8x11 sheet. I'll be using one of those in 4mm for the horizontal seam, just because it looks like it's supposed to be a little bit higher to me. Higher profile, I mean. The standard sheet isn't quite long enough, so I cut a length from it diagonally to get the extra few inches. Then I attached the strip to the mask. Finally, I attached the chemistry goggles strap using brackets cut from scrap 4mm foam. I had to attach it further inside the mask than I would have expected in order to get a decently snug fit. This may vary depending on the size of your head or what you're using as a strap. I know the whole chemistry goggles thing is interchangeable. You also use ski goggles or even just string. Yeah, it doesn't really matter because it's going to be covered up by a hoodie, so yeah, do whatever. Now, because it can be more difficult to find black foam than the much more common gray foam, I figure I should mention that you can get away with using the gray foam and then just paint it with black Plastidip. Just be sure to hold off on attaching the white frame until the black Plastidip is dried, which typically takes about half an hour, but I like to let things air out overnight, just for safety. I also glued a foam stopper in there so that the mask would rest snugly against my chin and not fall back against my neck. Lastly, for the rest of the costume, you'll need a colored painter suit, a rain suit, or colored sweatpants and hoodie. I went with the painter suit. Also an MP5. William Shakespeare Props does not endorse the use of prop firearms in public. The wall of my workshop, however, that's all good. Deadly giant Lego lightsabers. My armory is not as robust as it used to be, so I'll just have to settle for a P90. And that's how to make a Squid Game mask, or budget Stargate cosplay. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. Check out the past builds. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can check out the links in the description down below. Anything pledged goes towards improving the video quality, prop functionality, and shop equipment, and allowing me to put together bigger and more exciting projects for you to enjoy on the channel. Happy crafting! See you later!